Hello, everyone, and welcome to the David Gordon Memorial. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the David Gordon Memorial Lecture, sponsored annually by the Union for Radical Political Economics, URPE. My name is Zhongjin Li, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. On behalf of the editorial board of the Review of Radical Political Economics, RRPE, URPE's journal, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar. Founded in 1968, the Union for Radical Political Economics, URPE, is an interdisciplinary membership organization of academics and of activists. Its mission is to promote the study, development, and application of radical political economic analysis to social problems. Concretely, this involves a continuing critique of both the capitalist system and of all forms of exploitation and oppression. URPE's mission also includes coming out of this critique, helping to construct a progressive social policy and a human-centered radical alternative to capitalism. The David Gordon Lecture Series honors the legacy of Dr. David Gordon, a pioneering scholar whose work challenged orthodox economic thought and deepened our understanding of the structural forces shaping capitalism. Each year, URPE is proud to host a distinguished scholar in radical political economics to continue this tradition of critical inquiry at the Allied Social Science Association meetings. In solidarity with the Unite Here strike in San Francisco this year, we have rescheduled the meeting, and we thank you for all your patience. Many David Gordon Memorial Lectures have been published in URPE, and you can access in RRPE, and you can access the publications via the URPE website. To help us continue to do so, we would be extremely grateful for financial support from those who find these lectures valuable. Please consider helping us sustain this important platform for radical economic scholarship. NAB Nudis will post the URPE donation link in the chat. A special thank you to the URPE Steering Committee, RRP Editorial Board, and to our dedicated organizers, Enid Vincent, Steve Zaberg, and Deborah Nunes, whose efforts have made today's event possible. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Radhika Desai. Dr. Radhika is professor at the Department of Political Studies, University of Manitoba, Canada. She is also director for Geopolitical Economy Research Group. She also convenes the International Manifesto Group. She is also a past president of the Society for Socialist Studies. Her numerous articles have appeared in Capital and Class, Economic and Political Weekly, International Critical Thought, New Left Review, Third World Quarterly, World Review of Political Economy, and other journals, and in edited collections on parties, political economy, culture, and nationalism. She also has books on capitalism, coronavirus and war, geopolitical economy after US hegemony, globalization, and empire, etc. Along with a few edited books, Dr. Radhika Desai's work has been instrumental in shaping contemporary debates on economic power and geopolitical shifts. We are honored to have her join us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Radhika Desai. So Radhika, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes, great. So thank you so much, Zhonglin, and I will dive right into it. So here goes. I'm very honored and delighted to deliver the 27th David Gordon Memorial Lecture. Though we never met, David Gordon's influence on me was formative. I vividly remember reading his seminal 1988 New Left Review article, The Global Economy, New Edifice or Crumbling Foundations, as a graduate student. It blew holes in the nascent but soon to be very fashionable talk of globalization. Remaining a skeptic of a globalization discourse through its heyday in the 1990s, I went on to skepticism about US hegemony and empire in the next decade. Perhaps, like David Gordon, my intellectual antennae are especially attuned to detecting intellectual fads. And my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy, After US Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, sought to expose all such cosmopolitan discourses about international relations as essentially ideologies of imperialism. Gordon, who worked on segmented US labor markets beginning with his doctoral dissertation on class, productivity, and the ghetto, sensing that the Achilles heel of the US economy was bound to be its inability to fully integrate a Black working class, would have liked the anti-imperialism of my approach. And Geopolitical Economy's account of imperialisms and the United States' decline would have appealed to the scholar who wrote Fat and Mean, the corporate squeezing of working Americans and the myth of managerial downsizing. Both books detect feet of clay under giants. As the first quarter of the 21st century closes, decades-long impairment of productive accumulation and innovation in the US-led imperial core of the world economy continues relentlessly. In profound internal crisis, it is going rogue internationally, exacerbating the ecological emergency and threatening nuclear annihilation in a desperate struggle against proliferating challengers, not least the leading socialist country of our time, the People's Republic of China. Never has it been so urgent to understand the international relations of the waning age of capital through Marx and Engels' understanding of capitalism and its congenital relation with imperialism. Only such an understanding can show why the future of capitalism hangs in the balance of international power relations and how they may bend the arc of humanity's history towards socialism. At the same time, never have there been so many obstacles in the path to this enterprise, not only bourgeois and imperialist obstacles, but also Marxist ones. The latter arise from Marxist's now century-long policy of theoretical reconciliation with neoclassical economics. Though it emerged to legitimize capitalism after Marx and Engels' intervention had rendered classical political economy incapable of doing so, Western Marxists confined their critique of neoclassical economics to the neglect of exploitation, and whether because they were beneficiaries of imperial privilege or they were trained in neoclassical economics before coming to Marx, or both, they sought to fit the two antithetical bodies of thought together. In this impossible and therefore never-ending endeavor, they lost touch with Marx's analysis of capitalism as value production, whose necessary contradictions have always required states to manage them, whether through domestic or international actions. And of course, the international actions would be imperialism. And these actions have driven forward capitalism's history. The result has been pervasive theoretical confusion about capitalism and imperialism. The Western Marxist camp, broadly associated with Monthly Review, emphasizes the centrality of imperialism to capitalism, but without linking the two theoretically in Marxist terms. The New Left Review camp, by contrast, denies the theoretical relation outright. Little wonder, then, that rather than developing Marxist analysis of capitalism and imperialism at our climactic conjuncture, Marxists are either busy arguing that Marx was the real pioneer or superior theorists of the favorite ideologies of imperialism, such as free trade and globalization, or US hegemony and empire, or they are advancing claims that socialist China or the BRICS countries are as imperialist as the historic imperial core of the capitalist world. It is high time we return to the task of understanding imperialism as Marx and Engels would have in its relation to capitalism, and to understanding theoretically the conjoint fate of both. That is what I propose to do today, building on geopolitical economy, the new approach to the international affairs of the world of capital that I proposed a dozen years ago in my book of that name, and have been developing since in other works, including in my 2023 book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, A Geopolitical Economy. Two caveats at the outset. First, given time constraints, my critique of Marxist economics may appear too indiscriminate and unfair to particular scholars, many of whom I respect deeply, and I apologize in advance for that. And my account of Marx and Engels and of geopolitical economy will likewise have to remain skeletal. Fuller treatments appear in my related works, and some clarifications can be made in the question and answer session and in the fuller paper that I intend to submit. Marx analyzed capitalism as the contradictory production of value, operating at the intersection of the two axes you see here, the vertical axis of surplus extraction and the horizontal one of competition. Value was the labor embodied in commodities produced to accumulate surplus in competition with other producers, and competition pressed down their prices to the socially necessary level. In their attempts to reconcile this kind of Marxist analysis with neoclassical economics, Marxist economists have, at least since Tugan von Baranovsky's writings in the 1880s, raised three principal indictments against Marx. They have argued, first, that Marx's value analysis had a transformation problem. That is to say, it could not transform values into prices, pinning Ricardo's problem on Marx and failing to understand the price-value relations as Marx understood it. Secondly, they claim that Marx did not believe that capitalism suffered from a deficit of demand, a point I have refuted thoroughly through close study of the Grundrisse and the 3 volumes of Capital. And they claim that Marx was wrong about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall because capitalists would not invest if it resulted in lower profit rates, when in fact Marx had argued that while every capitalist invested to increase his profits, the social and inadvertent result was to reduce profit rates. The analysis of capitalism that emerges from such a Marxist economics could hardly be farther than Marx and Engels. In this Marxist economics, value and the manifold contradictions of its social production no longer govern society. And in this chart, you see, I can't go into it in great detail, but my attempt to systematize our understanding of capitalist crises. So instead, markets and prices govern an economy separated from the rest of society and operating harmoniously without contradiction. The many contradictions of capital, which arise not only in the core realms of production and realization here, but also in other realms that must be systematically distorted for capitalism to exist, taking distinct distinct horizontal intra-class forms and vertical interclass forms, were ignored. All these contradictions are largely ignored, or they are treated in isolation from one another, and so on. The study of capitalist societies, as a result, was separated into distinct disciplines, emerging around neoclassical economics in what I call the new social scientific division of labor in the late 19th century. Weber sanctified this, claiming that in modern capitalist societies, social activity becomes separated into autonomous realms of economic, social, and political activity, and so on. However, economics in this division of labor enjoyed an especially privileged position. And this was necessary at a time when working class organization and demands for reform were being insistently felt. Marxist intellectuals and scholars then developed Marxist versions of sociology and politics or international relations or what have you, always accepting Marxist economists' understanding of capitalism as harmonious and self-regulating. All of this was alien to classical political economy and to Marx, for whom the capitalist social form, whose myriad contradictions ensnarl every realm of society, needed to be studied as a whole more than most other social forms. But that was not all. Shorn of contradiction, capitalist societies did not need state intervention to manage them, whether through domestic or international, that is to say, imperialist actions. Such Marxist economists fail to conceive of capitalism as historical, not just as a historically specific form, which they often did, but because, as they say, there is no saint without a past and no sinner without a future, a social form in historical evolution, with its unfolding contradictions and states' management of these contradictions, adding layer upon layer of modifying institutions and practices. Instead, Marxist economists considered the institutions of capitalism in neoclassical fashion as, in Simon Clarke's words, the supra-historical manifestations of reason, and so the universal foundations of a society characterized by its formal rationality, namely capitalism. As I have argued elsewhere, Marxist economists therefore divided on the question of capitalism and imperialism into two broad camps. One, neglecting the theorization of the relation while paying attention to imperialism, while the other denied it altogether. As I say in this article, initially some Marxist economists, preeminently those associated with the US journal Monthly Review, for whom imperialism and anti-imperialism were politically very important, sought to comprehend them through an eclectic, not particularly Marxist theoretical framework, leaving the terrain of Marxist analysis of capitalism as value production. Later, others who we know as political Marxists of the Brennerite or New Left Review variety opposed such eclecticism as Smithian. They resorted to a pure and purely economic and therefore contradiction-free Ricardian conception of capitalism above any need for the state management of its contradictions. The latter could hardly deny the reality of imperialism. However, they denied its necessity to capitalism. In the words of Anthony Brewer, capitalism does not need a subordinated hinterland or periphery, though it will use and profit from it if it exists. Once industrial capital had taken charge, capitalist conquest could play a progressive, though brutal, role in initiating capitalist industrialization. The origins and rapid development of capitalism in Europe and its slow penetration in Asia were the result of differences in the preceding modes of production in these areas. European domination was a consequent, not the primary cause of this difference. Marxist economists were therefore left with a Schumpeterian rather than a Marxist conception of capitalism, one exhibiting boundless Promethean productivity. They attributed the prosperity of the imperialist core exclusively to this productivity and not to imperialism. Such a capitalism was therefore was thought of as going from strength to strength forever, unless overthrown by sheer political will. Apart from capitalism's contradictions, this view also ignored Marx's view that by the time capitalism arrived at its monopoly phase, it would have exhausted what historically progressive character it had and would have become ripe for socialism. Having developed the forces of production by socializing labor among firms in its competitive phase, it would now do so by socializing labor within gigantic monopoly firms, vast apparatuses of planned production that formed the pinnacle of capitalism's development of, as Marx and Engels put it in the manifesto, the development of the productive forces that slumbered in the lap of social labor. In Marx's words, with the arrival of monopoly, capital now receives the form of social capital, capital of directly associated individuals, in contrast to private capital, and its enterprises appear as social enterprises as opposed to private ones. This is the abolition of capital and of private property within the confines of the capitalist mode of production itself. Monopoly is, Marx continues, a self-abolishing contradiction, the necessary point of transition toward the transformation of capital back into the property of producers, though no longer as the private property of individual producers, but rather as the property as their property as associated producers, as directly social property. Burdened with such a conception of capitalism, therefore, Marxist international relations, which borrowed this kind of understanding from Marxist economics, have largely tailed bourgeois currents of thought. One branch of Marxist international relations attacks scholars of globalization only to claim that what they were talking about was old hat, and that in fact Marx was the original, most profound theorist of globalization. However, only a few pages after the passages in the manifesto from which such misapprehensions arise, Marx and Engels speak about the centrality of the nation state to capitalism. The bourgeoisie, they say, keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized the means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this is political centralization. Independent but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation become lumped together into one nation, one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. Further, they say that though not in substance yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie, it is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of every country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. And further, that working men have no country. We cannot take away from them what they have not got, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation. It is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. Another current of Marxist international relations joined the spate of writing about US hegemony and empire in the 2000s. However, as I argued in my Geopolitical Economy, US hegemony remained a zealously pursued ambition to replace Britain as the managing segment of the world economy. It could not be achieved even though the acquisition of an empire, let alone one comparable to Britain's, having already become too costly a proposition in the world of imperial competition, US ruling circles had diluted that ambition, confining it to making the dollar the world's money. However, as much of geopolitical economy is preoccupied with arguing, the dollar could not and did not serve as world money stably. Having emerged in the 1970s, hegemony theories remained largely marginal and heavily contested for decades before enjoying, in between the launch of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and their quagmire phase, soon to be followed by the 2008 North Atlantic financial crisis, a brief supernova phase. Since then, amid talk of multipolarity, a scissor has opened up between the United States' inability to forsake its vain ambition and its rapidly declining ability to achieve it. And this contrast was more notable than any US hegemony. A final current of Marxist international relations, meanwhile, struggles with claims like, and I'm quoting, there is necessarily a realist moment in any Marxist understanding of international relations and conjunctures. In other words, any such analysis must take into account the strategies, calculations, and interactions of rival political elites in the state system, in addition to the economic rivalries. These people are unable to apprehend that both of these have to be viewed as a single historical narrative. And such a narrative can only be developed from Marx and Engels' resolution of the unresolved problems and antinomies of classical political economy. Without Marx's planned volume on world trade, as you know, he had planned Capital in several volumes, one of which was to be on world trade, we have no comprehensive account of what his understanding of the international relations of capitalism would have been. However, he and Engels wrote enough about this to furnish us with what I take to be would have been the main elements. And let me go through some of them, or the main ones. Contrary to the assumption that Marx and Engels spoke only of classes, not of nations, they considered nations historical actors just as they did classes. Consider Marx's withering criticism of the free trader vulgaris in debates on free trade in the late 1840s. Marx criticized these people as follows: if the free traders cannot understand how one nation can grow rich at the expense of another, we need not wonder these same gentlemen also refuse to understand how within one country, one class can enrich itself at the expense of another. So Marx and Engels, Marx puts these two entities, class and nation, side by side in a single understanding. While most Marxists concede the role of the state in the primitive accumulation, the separation of millions from the land on which capitalism was founded, few acknowledge that it continued to be central to capitalism thereafter. But Marx and Engels, in addition to the passages already quoted to this effect, also spoke, among other things, about the class struggle involving legislative recognition of the particular interests of workers, essentially ensuring that class struggle involves state intervention. Talked of bourgeoisie pitted against the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. Talked about imperial subordination prompting the reaction of protection. And spoke of monopoly provoking further state intervention. Another point. Contrary to the assumption of a pure, unchanging, purely economic, self-regulating capitalism, for Marx and Engels, capitalism is embedded, historical, and constantly changing, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, though in capital, value production is abstracted from the social context for heuristic reasons, a purely capitalist economy did not exist for Marx and Engels. Such a contradiction-riddled contraption could not exist. Value production emerged in a wider social context, which could never be dispensed with, only ever more distorted to support capitalism as it lurched from crisis to crisis. As Engels pointed out, though and I'm quoting him now, though the law of value and the distribution of surplus value by means of the rate of profit only attain their most complete approximate realization on the presupposition that capitalist production has everywhere been completely established, this does not exist even in England and never will exist. We shall not let it get so far as that. The last sentence, the last phrase expressed revolutionary optimism that capitalism would be extinguished long before it overtook society as a whole. And not only does capitalism exist within a society in a non-capitalist cocoon of social and political institutions, it does so internationally in a cocoon of subordinated societies. Capitalism cannot be self-contained. It necessarily overspills its boundaries because capitalist states must deal with its contradictions in part through imperial actions. It cannot deal with the consequences of capitalist contradictions within the confines of a given capitalist state. Contrary to the view that Marx and Engels supported cosmopolitan free trade views, which would have required them to subscribe to the twin Ricardian fictions of Say's law and comparative advantage, and Marx was critical of both, Marx supported free trade in the late 1840s only because at that time it appeared likely to advance the cause of working people by advancing the cause of capitalism against feudalism. However, it was equally possible that in other circumstances, protection would advance the same cause. The protective system, he says, is nothing but a means of establishing manufacture on a large scale in any country. That is to say, of making it dependent on the market of the world. And from the moment that dependence on the market of the world is established, there is more or less dependence on free trade also. Besides this, the protective system helps develop free competition within free competition within a nation. Hence, we see that in countries where the bourgeoisie is beginning to make itself felt as a class, in Germany, for example, it makes great efforts to obtain protective duties. They serve the bourgeoisie as weapons against feudalism and the absolute monarchy, as a means for the concentration of its own powers for the realization of free trade within the country. This point is reinforced by Engels in the 1880s, an era of widespread protection. Though in the mid-19th century, Engels says, confirmed the view that free trade is the normal condition of capitalist production, things soon changed. The question arose, as Engels posed it, whether in the face of Britain's fabulous success, other countries were to sit still and submit to this change, which degraded them to be mere agricultural appendages of England, the workshop of the world. So were they to do that? No, they did not. And protectionism, rather than free trade, became the plan that would soonest bring capitalist society to a deadlock. Such resistance to English domination could emerge anywhere. In his writings on British rule in India, often misread as an at least backhanded justification of colonialism, Marx envisaged not just a class, but also national liberation. Marx said, the Indians will not reap the fruits of the new elements of society scattered among them by the British bourgeoisie until in Great Britain itself, the now ruling classes have been supplanted by the industrial proletariat, or till the Hindus themselves have grown strong enough to throw off the English yoke altogether. So there are two possibilities. So having absorbed this, we are now ready to understand what I would call Marx's geopolitical economy and what he called the relations of producing nations. This is clearest in Marx's discussion of the US mercantilist Henry Carey. Characteristically, Carey considered US domestic relations of production spontaneously harmonious. He said there's nothing wrong within the US. The trouble lay on the international plane. Here, Carey called for protection against England's industrial monopoly upon the world market and against the destructive power of large-scale English industry. In this duality, Marx detects the contradiction that constitutes the motor of the international relations of capitalism, the contradictions that drive them forward. So let's take a look at this. Marx says, with Carey, the harmony of bourgeois relations of production ends with the most complete disharmony of these relations on the grandest terrain where they appear, the world market, and in their grandest development as the relations of producing nations. All the relations which appear harmonious to him within specific national boundaries appear disharmonious when they appear in their most developed form, in the world market form, as the international relations which produce English domination of the world market. What Carey has not grasped is that these world market disharmonies are merely the ultimate adequate expressions of the disharmonies that have become fixed as abstract relations within the economic categories or which have a local existence on the smallest scale. This contradiction, Marx says, forms the originality of Carey's writings and gives them their significance. In short, let's rehearse what Marx is saying here. Marx is saying that the contradictions of capitalism manifest themselves on the international plane, that the plane is the grandest terrain where these contradictions appear, that they appear there in their grandest development. The contradictions on the international plane is, one more point. Marx says that they are the development of the contradictions that he examines in Capital that appear within societies at a local scale. And finally, for Marx, the contradiction on the international plane is centrally about development, about the structural transformation of society to the development of its forces of production and its productive capacities. It is a contradiction between imperial domination, which denies development, and anti-imperialist resistance to it through the pursuit of state-directed protectionist development that achieves it. Further, the term producing nations is worth pondering. Marx does not say capitalist nations, because he is aware that pre-capitalist social forms persist in the age of capital. Imperial subordination distorts other societies. And as we know from Marx's exchanges with Vera Zasulich, some countries might turn socialist without becoming substantially capitalist, a possibility that could only grow as capitalism in its homelands entered its monopoly phase and ripened for socialist transformation. So here we have Marx and Engels' geopolitical economy of the relations of producing nations, which Trotsky would later dub uneven and combined development. It is the dialectic between imperial domination, for which imperialist nations also compete, and resistance to it. Dominant capitalist nations seek complementarity between their economies and those they dominate so that they can form the necessary cocoon for their capitalisms. Though imperialism takes many forms, for example, environmental waste dumping in poor countries, cultural imperialism, and so on, the core processes of value production involve four principal forms: two involving capitalism's outputs and two involving its inputs. Subordinated territories must be the markets for excess commodities and outlets for excess capital. And at the same time, they must be suppliers of cheap inputs, raw materials, intermediate goods, and wage goods, and must be the reservoirs of cheap labor. Surprise, surprise, these two pairs are contradictory. The subordinated periphery must be prosperous and stable enough to accept capitalism's excess commodities and capital, while it must be pretty poor to offer up cheap goods and labor. And the contradictions don't end there. Nations able and willing to resist this subordination seek, through state-directed development, protectionist development, what Trotsky called combined development, similarity in terms of the levels of industrial and technological development. That is to say, imperialism requires complementarity, and anti-imperialist development seeks to create similarity. This dialectic between the denial of development and the successful pursuit of development has been the motor driving forward the tumultuous relations of producing nations in the age of capital to this day, when capitalist nations are involved in desperately, violently, and horrifically ensuring their survival. In this dialectic, though imperialism is very powerful, anti-imperialist combined state-directed development has prevailed since at least the late 19th century, making the world ever more multipolar. Its logic is not governed by globalization, it's not governed by a succession of hegemonies, but by the prevalence of combined development in the dialectic of uneven and combined development. And it is this combined development that has spread productive capacity around the world. So now we are ready to understand the history of how it has done so. In the first phase of combined development, the development and industrialization of countries like the United States, Germany, or Japan, this first phase could be capitalist because the world still contained weak states that the new industrializers could subordinate. Attuned to the rumbling international contradictions of capitalism, Engels had predicted in the late 1880s that the outcome of the resulting capitalist competition for colonies would be a world war, and he did this with remarkable accuracy. He spoke of a world war of an extent and violence hitherto unimagined. 8 to 10 million soldiers will be at each other's throats, and in the process, they will strip Europe barer than a swarm of locusts. The depredations of the 30 Years' War compressed into 3 to 4 years and extended over the entire continent. Famine, disease, the universal lapse into barbarism, both of the armies and the people, in the wake of acute misery, irretrievable dislocation of our artificial system of trade, industry, and credit, ending in universal bankruptcy. the collapse of old states and their conventional political wisdom to the points where crowns will roll into gutters by the dozen and no one will be around to pick them up. The absolute impossibility of foreseeing how it will end and who will emerge as victor from this battle. Only one consequence is absolutely certain: universal exhaustion and the creation of the conditions of the ultimate victory of the working class. After war had already broken out, Lenin famously proposed that the war constituted the highest stage of, that capitalism now was at its highest stage. This assertion is almost universally rejected today, but it demands a closer look. Lenin's argument that imperialist competition caused the war through the final partitioning of the globe, final not in the sense that repartition is impossible. On the contrary, repartitions are possible and inevitable, but in the sense that the colonial policies of the capitalist countries has completed the seizure of the unoccupied territories on our planet, this assertion is widely accepted, or fairly widely accepted. However, Lenin's view that capitalism had itself reached its peak and now faced decline is not. However, Lenin was merely developing Marx's prophetic point about capitalism exhausting its historically progressive potential in its monopoly phase, a point Hilferding also developed. And Lenin, of course, as you know, relied on Hilferding a great deal in writing Imperialism. In Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin spoke of how capitalism in its imperialist stage leads directly to the most comprehensive socialization of production, so to speak, drags the capitalist against their will and consciousness into some sort of new social order, a transitional one from complete free competition to complete socialization. And further, he says, the old capitalism, the capitalism of free competition, is passing away. A new capitalism has come to take its place, bearing the obvious features of something transient, a mixture of free competition and monopoly. The question naturally arises, into what is this new capitalism developing? But bourgeois scholars are afraid to raise these questions, the implication being that they are afraid of the answer. The First World War and the veritable 30 years crisis that included the umbilically linked Second World War, and of course also included the Great Depression, constituted the conjoint climactic crises of capitalism and imperialism. And they could not have been ended without help from Soviet forces and Chinese forces. It should be clear by now that considering the Russian and Chinese revolutions' historical and geographical mistakes, premature and erupting in the wrong countries is no longer tenable. Bookending the 30 years crisis, they were part of a revolutionary wave which was successful only outside the imperialist countries, not least because imperialism buttressed the power of these capitalist states vis-a-vis their own working classes as well. These revolutions had to be socialist because further imperialism was no longer possible, and that shut the capitalist road to countries rejecting imperial subordination. Socialism emerged as the principal way to develop. Except for a small number of jurisdictions, the biggest being South Korea and the Chinese province of Taiwan, which developed thanks to their role as frontline states of imperialism. Only socialism has brought developments and levels of popular welfare remotely comparable to that in the imperialist countries. Above all, first in the Soviet Union, and today in the People's Republic of China. The idea that capitalism was past its peak in the early 20th century was not confined to Marxists. After Stalingrad assured Allied victory, and as decolonization could not be denied colonies contributing to this victory for much longer, major intellectuals like Keynes and Polanyi were convinced that the world would swing decisively away from capitalism, while Hayek, fearing the same, penned his The Road to Serfdom. The golden age of capitalist growth that followed the Second World War led most, including Marxists, to dismiss these expectations. The golden age was taken as proof that capitalism had regained its dynamism and would keep going on for decades, if not centuries. Isolated skeptics were accused of predicting 10 out of the last 2 crises and looking for needles of stagnation amid large haystacks of evidence of growth and dynamism. However, the golden age of world growth was not due to capitalism, but to a substantial, if incomplete, worldwide left turn. While the communist world, now extending from Prague to Pyongyang, grew at impressive rates, and newly developing countries implemented distinctly left-leaning development strategies, poor capitalist countries also had to make major concessions to their working classes and erect Keynesian welfare states, involving reforms that, in Hobsbawm's words, would have once been rejected as socialist. These reforms, which inter alia expanded domestic demand to compensate for the loss of colonial markets, permitted the high rates of growth. This should have been clear even then, and we can discuss that, but it was clear to some. But today, the historical record makes it indisputable. As the underlying capitalism of the West ran into crises in the 1970s, combining constrained demand, falling profits, increased labor and input prices, and above all, constrained options for imperial resolutions, the solution was sought not in deepening the reforms, but in rolling them back. In the ensuing decades, neoliberal policies have released capital from its post-war shackles, claiming that this would release capitalism's competitive animal spirits, restore its productive dynamism. However, they did not and could not. Giving freedom to monopolistic capitalism could only encourage monopolistic vices, not productive competitive virtues. And these monopolistic vices included anti-competitive behavior, financialization, low investment, technological backwardness, etc. And they could not restore either investment or growth. Persistent, decades-long failure has not led to the displacement of neoliberalism as the ruling policy paradigm, because it was never about the displacement. It was never about markets or competition, but always about promoting the interest and political power of giant monopoly corporations. And the political power of giant monopoly corporations will ensure that neoliberalism is not abandoned as long as they can help it. Today, the decline of capitalism and imperialism reinforce one another. Capitalism's decline reduces its imperial capacities, while imperial weakness constrains capitalism's ability to externalize the consequences of its mounting and multiplying contradictions. This dual logic is at work on all fronts that make imperialism necessary. The core processes of capitalist value production, though in the neoliberal era, which has exacerbated rather than resolved the demand problem, the role of the subordinated world in providing cheap inputs and labor dominates. So let's look at all four. First, the subordinated periphery as the destination for surplus goods. Except for a few niches, such as the oil-producing countries of the Middle East and tiny slivers of the population living westernized lifestyles outside the imperial core, the rest of the world has stopped serving the core capitalist countries as markets for its surplus commodities, worsening the investment climate. While neoliberalism has exacerbated the demand problem, industrial development outside the core, principally in China, but also in many other developing countries to a lesser extent, has added industrial capacity. Exports are less of a solution. Protectionism is on the rise, and growth is becoming domestic market focused. So if we look at this chart, you will see that growth rates, having peaked in the late 1990s, have consistently reduced, and in the 2010s in particular, have been quite low. And if you see the next chart here, the trade intensity of growth is declining, and you can see that both in China and in the rest of the developing world, world, gross exports as a share of gross output in goods, as well as imported intermediate products as a share of gross goods output, have been declining. So the trade intensity of growth is lower in these countries. The next point is the subordinated periphery, the destination of surplus capital. The buzz around the globalization of production and the power of multinational corporations implies that Western capital is migrating from capitalism's homelands to the rest of the world, resulting in deindustrialization in capitalism's homelands. However, the West has been deindustrialized without substantially increasing its hold on the productive systems of the West. There is no torrent of Western capital or investment heading south. It's headed mostly into speculative and financial markets or into predatory lending or towards other prosperous first world countries. For most countries, roughly 80 to 85%, if not more, of gross fixed capital formation is accounted for by domestic investment and not foreign direct investment. Moreover, most FDI goes from one major capitalist economy to another. Outside the imperialist countries, a small number, preeminently China, account for bulk of the incoming FDI. Thus, since the imperialism's 1914 peak, when a handful of imperialist countries divided up the world amongst themselves in search of economic territory, imperialism has not been able to expand the zone of the world in which it can safely invest. What is generally touted as the globalization of production refers not to foreign direct investment, but to so-called global value chains, in which Western corporations contract with independent firms, enter in market relationships with them, not ownership relationships, for the supply of inputs or goods. If served by robust developmental states like China's, these independent firms are able to move up the value chains and become instruments not of imperialism, but of anti-imperialist development. Though the US intended China to remain a low-cost producer of low-technology products and a low-cost performer of low-value processes, it was able to move up the value chain in precisely this manner and pose the greatest challenge to US imperialism, both economically and technologically. As the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's critical technology tracker, an old-style anti-communist and alarmism, if there was one, noted recently, the United States led in 60 of 64 technologies in the 5 years from 2003 to 2007. But in the most recent 5 years, 2019 to 2023, is leading in 7. China led in just 3 of 64 technologies in 2003 and 2007, but is now the lead country in 57 of 64 technologies in 2019 to 2023, increasing its lead from our rankings last year, where it was leading in 52 technologies. So that's about the production part. What about imperialism, the subordinated periphery as a source of cheap inputs? The return of inflation shows imperial countries losing their ability to compel cheap products from the rest of the world. It is its ability to do so since the 1980s until recently through punishing neoliberal structural adjustment processes that imposed cruel income deflation on the rest of the world that had kept inflation low. Not any policy dexterity of its central bankers, as implied in the practical deification of figures like Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, and others. And what about the source of cheap labor? Headlines blaring the end of cheap Chinese labor are now over a decade old. And most countries' population growth rates today are dipping below replacement levels. While the consequences of this development for labor supply in the capitalist core may lie down the road, another development is already constraining its ability to manage labor supply. Rising racism in the imperialist countries, itself the result of their productive decline, has complicated the task of keeping the labor market loose by opening the spigots of immigration. So on all these four fronts, imperialism is losing its power. And as it does so, I can actually stop sharing now. Where do I do that? Oh. Sorry. Oh, all right. Maybe I can't do that. On all these four fronts, therefore, imperialism is losing its power. And as it does so, its ability to sustain capitalism in its homelands, in keeping the periphery subordinated, is declining. The historical aperture for socialism as the only way to promote development is opening wider than ever. Rather than productive domination, imperialism is today left defending its diminishing ability to suck up value from working people and producing nations around the world through its deeply contradictory dollar-denominated financial system, whose crisis appears increasingly imminent. This, I humbly submit, is a proper understanding of the history of capitalism, as Marx understood it, the history of contradictory value production, which requires imperialism, but also prompts the growth of its opponent, anti-imperialist combined and today necessarily socialist development. If the working class is the gravedigger of capitalism at home, states pursuing development because capitalism will not develop them, which will inevitably be forced into socialist paths, are its gravediggers at the international plane. That is why the future of capitalism hangs in the balance as much of international power between declining capitalist countries and rising socialist ones as in the balance of power between capitalists and working people. Thank you. I'm just going to see if I can stop this share. I figured out how to share in this inventive way, but I'm not sure I can figure out how to stop it.
Okay, so I'm finally able to unmute myself. Thank you, Radhika, for the insightful and the thought-provoking presentation. Your analysis offers much to reflect on, especially in the light of today's shifting dynamics of economic power and geopolitical change. We now invite attendees to join the discussion. This is a great opportunity to engage directly with Dr. Desai, ask questions, and dive deeper into some of the ideas she has presented. Please feel free to submit your questions in chat or indicate you would like to speak directly. We should be able to get your questions delivered. Let me see. So on my end, the chat is now on. Okay. Okay, so we have a few hands up. Okay, so we will start from Jeremy Launch, and others, please feel very free to submit your questions in the chat function. Okay, so Deb, could you unmute Jeremy here?
Yes, I can. I just want to clarify that there's a Q&A little button down there so people can ask their questions there. We already have 2 questions in the line. So either raise your hand and ask out loud like Jerome did, and I'm going to unmute them in a second, or put your written question there.
Oh, okay. Now I see. Thank you. Great. So let's wait for a few questions while Jeremy, now you can ask questions. Does this work?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. Hi. Yeah, I can't see a Q&A. I can only see a chat, but I can't chat there. So I don't know, maybe it doesn't look the same for everyone. But anyway, I'm going to ask, I've got two questions. The first is about what you said in the very beginning. Thank you for the great and dense presentation about neoclassical economics. He was saying that a Marxist analysis kind of got lost in trying to integrate it in neoclassical frameworks. I would tend to disagree. I would tend to agree, sorry, but I just want to know whether you think that neoclassical economics is by nature capitalist, neoliberal. I mean, some people conflate neoclassical, neoliberal, liberal, capitalist. Others say no, but there was still socialist, neoclassical economists from the very start, like Valhas and others. So just wanted your opinion on that, but also how that relates to your argument, because then I was kind of looking for later in the presentation for some recall of that neoclassical mention, but I didn't see the connection, so maybe I missed something. And then my second question was about population decline in the industrial countries, which you also mentioned. And I also was wondering there, how do you relate it to your argument, and how exploitation, imperialism, or whichever it was. Thank you very much.
Sure. Shall I answer now, or shall we bunch a few together?
We have two questions in the Q&A session. Sorry, everyone, the chat function is disabled. Let's use the Q&A section. There are two questions in the Q&A section, and I wonder if, Radhika, you can combine
Sure.
the answers to...
I'll address them in turn as well. Sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, Jeremy, thank you for those questions. They were really excellent questions. And again, like I said, my presentation was bound to be very skeletal. So this gives me an opportunity to at least expand on some aspect of this. So is neoclassical economics necessarily pro-capitalist? No. Then this is the interesting question. So, of course, bulk of the neoclassical economics we normally encounter today is neoliberalism, which is pro-capitalist, largely derives from the Austrian school. They were the most ideologically committed to capitalism. Whereas sort of more equilibrium style Walrasian economics actually tended to give rise to, in fact, oddly enough, phenomena like the socialist calculation debate. Because, I quoted Simon Clarke and his very good book, Marxism, Marginalism, and Modern Sociology, which is worth a read. But in it, he says another really interesting thing, and that is that neoclassical economics treats capitalism, or treats the economy, as if it were a system of the provisioning of human needs, when it is the last thing ever to be imagined. It's the furthest thing from that. So, but because the theoretical structure of neoclassical economics is about a system geared to the provisioning of human needs, it is easily adapted to things like, to conceiving a socialist economy. But it is lousy at analyzing capitalism. Do you get my point? Okay, so that's my answer to your question, whether neoclassical economics is necessarily a pro-capitalist. My answer to your question about population is, again, again, you ask a seriously important question. I mean, I remember when I first read Capital, and I arrived at Capital Volume 1, and I arrived at chapter 25, which is entitled something like The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. And I would have imagined with such a title that it would be sort of all sorts of equations about the organic composition of capital and what have you. Nothing doing. It was about population. It is about how every system of social production has its laws of population. And what Marx is saying in these pages very much accords with later cutting-edge studies of migration and so on. You see, capitalism faces certain problems when it comes to labor, raw materials, etc., because these things are not made available by any capitalist means. Raw materials are made available by the earth. Labor is made available by human populations and societies. And so on the one hand, Marx says capitalism creates a surplus population because, it essentially increasing organic composition of capital reduces the demand for labor, etc. But essentially what he's also saying is that when capitalism is moving at a fast clip, it sucks labor in from everywhere. And its need for labor is very huge. And so it cannot do without migration, because you can have more babies, but they're not going to be ready to labor for many years, depending on the skill level of the work involved. So you must have migration. And then, of course, you also create struggles around migration, because when capitalism enters a down phase, it spits out all the labor and says, okay, everybody go back where you came from, but there is nowhere for these people anymore to go back to. So in that sense, questions of demography, migration, etc., are wrapped up in capitalism as well, very deeply. So those are my answers to your questions. And now to go to the questions in the Q&A, Mark Ginsburg asks, what do unilateral coercive measures, that is sanctions, what roles do they play in the story that you've shared? So I would say that obviously, to me, they are part of the they are a sign that the ability of Western countries to impose its will on the rest of the world is decreasing. Because there is a funny thing about sanctions is that, the literature on sanctions is divided between those people who talk about its effects, which are often murderous. They have been killing people since sanctions were imposed on Iraq back in the late 90s and even earlier. I mean, sanctions have been imposed on Cuba and have exacted a human cost there for 70 years. Okay, so they are often murderous, these sanctions, but are they effective? Are they able to achieve the goals for which they are imposed? Are they able to change the behavior of these countries? No. So in that sense, sanctions are, to me, a part of the declining ability of the West. I mean, take sanctions on Russia. And, as the rest of the world becomes increasingly aware of the limits of Western power, as the ability, as the number of carrots in the West's offer to the rest of the world shrink and the number of sticks grow, the rest of the world increasingly escapes the clutches of capital. And so sanctions on Russia haven't been particularly effective because essentially Russia, of course, already had a fairly big economy. Russia has all sorts of things that the whole world wants, including energy and so on. And Russia was able to make a close relationship with the biggest challenger to the capitalist code, namely China. So all of these things show that the more the world becomes multipolar, the more countries are able to develop and so on, the options for refusing subordination to the West increase. So to me, sanctions are the part of that story. And then I have another question here. How does your argument tie in with what Trump and his cohorts are up to now? I would say I've written about this, and if you're interested, if you just Google Radhika Desai frontline Trump, you will find this article. It's open access. I've written about it. Basically, my thesis on Trump and how it connects with what I've been saying today is that the election of Trump itself represents the deep crisis that the United States is in. And Trump, no matter what Trump thinks, and quite frankly, I'm not sure he thinks very much, but whatever Trump thinks or does the fate of that will be governed by three important forces. Number one, he's had to make certain promises to get elected. So all this grandstanding with tariffs, destructive as it is for both Americans and others, is really all about communicating to the people who voted for him that, look, I am actually addressing your concerns by imposing these tariffs and so on. And remember what he's done, because he has won the election by telling a very big lie. He has told Americans, so he understood what Biden and others didn't understand. He understood what the Democrats didn't understand, that you can't tell Americans that their economy is booming. They're not going to believe it. It doesn't accord with their experience. So Trump understood that. So he said, yes, folks, you are suffering. I know that. But what he said then was that you are suffering not because of four and a half decades of neoliberal policy, but you are suffering because of China and because of immigrants. And so he has to make a big song and dance about things like tariffs and so on. But this is going to be opposed by, so he must make a song and dance about tariffs. That's the first point. The second point is that, of course, the effects of these tariffs, both on ordinary Americans by raising inflation, rising costs of living, and so on, is going to create a backlash, and Trump must be mindful of that. And his own crony capitalists who are, swarming around Mar-a-Lago and the White House every day are going to tell him that this is not working. Let's see whether these auto tariffs go through, because, I mean, American cars are made all over the world. Are the automakers going to stand for it? If they stand for it, I mean, when will things snap? And the final point, which is going to govern the fate of what the US does, is that Trump is acting as though the United States' weight in the world economy is so great that everybody will shake in their socks when they hear the word tariffs. No, the US share of world imports, depending on how you count it, is between, depending on how you count it, I have read a figure of 10% and I have read high-end figure of 15.9%, so say 16%, between 10 and 16%, not a small figure, but not huge either. And barring Mexico and Canada, which are in really deep doo-doo with Trump, they are going to be dragged into all of everything that Americans are being dragged into. The rest of the world will suffer a shock, a sharp shock, but a short shock. They will get up, they will dust themselves off, and they will turn away from the United States and start trading with one another. So the overall effect of all of these shenanigans of Trump, and remember, they are just a symptom of a far deeper crisis. Trump is not in control. Trump does not control anything. Trump gets buffeted about by all the different forces that are creating the crisis in the United States. The overall effect of Trump's actions will be to marginalize the United States in the world economy more than it already is. It's going to make if sanctions had already made the US a pariah in many respects, these actions will make them even more so, because it doesn't matter if in the end he doesn't impose the tariffs. But the uncertainty that he has already created, which is now already 2 months long, is too much. Can you rely on such a partner? And remember, it's not Trump. Tomorrow, J.D. Vance may become president, and he will continue the same behavior for the same reason. Even Vance will not be in control. Even Vance will be a symptom of the crisis. This is the point. So that's my answer to the Trump question. Shall I just go down the list?
Yes, one more question about Trump regarding whether he belongs to...
That's right.
Okay.
So Mr. Trump represents a different capitalist class. Why is he contradicting with globalism, etc.? So, this is really interesting. So in the last little while, like since Trump's first term, and then we had Biden, and then Trump came back. So in the last, whatever it is, 10 odd years, we have had a fair amount of writing on this topic. So some people have distinguished between the sort of cowboy maverick capitalists like Peter Thiel and some other Koch brothers and so on. These guys who early on supported Trump, and what they call the house-trained, more domesticated capitalists who who supported Biden and so on. So there are two types of capitalists. But what you see now, what we saw during Trump's inauguration, remember that those pictures from the inauguration, more or less the whole capitalist class was there, saluting Trump effectively. And Elon Musk even did that obnoxious salute. They are all accepting that Trump has won the election. The Democrats are in deep crisis. If you want anything from the government, you better cozy up with Trump. So how long there will remain two different types of capitalists in the United States is an open question. And this is very interesting. It reminds me of a previous thing. Sometimes people talk about Wall Street and Main Street. Some people even think that Trump is speaking for Main Street while Biden spoke for Wall Street. This is complete nonsense. Trump is as much invested. Look at all this crypto stuff. Is as much invested in Wall Street as anything else. But back in the 1980s, I narrate this in my book, Geopolitical Economy. Back in the 1980s, when Paul Volcker was keeping interest rates very high, American industrialists as a group went to the White House to plead with Ronald Reagan, saying, look, you've got to stop this. We are really suffering, etc. But I would say that since that time, given the financialization of Main Street corporations, of productive corporations, where, things like GM makes more money lending you money to buy a car than it does selling you the car. With this financialization, whether there is any more an independent productive capitalist class as opposed to a financial capitalist class can be questioned. And similarly, I would say after Trump's been in office for a term, if he lasts that long, something else doesn't happen, and God knows what can happen. But once this term is over, maybe there won't be any difference between the maverick and the house-trained capitalists, and we don't even know whether the Democratic Party can in any way recover, and how will it recover. So we'll have to see about that. Then there is a question about my critique of monthly review, and I can try and answer that. Should I just keep going down the list?
Yes, and
Okay.
I'll try to combine some questions while you answer this one.
Okay. I'm not sure I can combine them because I haven't read them. I'm just reading them and responding to them. So if you want to combine some, please go ahead. But I'll just answer the next question and then you can combine some questions. Okay. So could I develop my critique of monthly review? See, first of all, let me say I have great respect for monthly review. I read it very often. I learn a lot from it. So don't get me wrong. It's not about the 95% on which we are all agreed. It's about the 5% on which we disagree. So let me state that first off the bat. However, having said that, I would say I wrote a 2020 article, which you can find on my academia.edu website. Or you can just look at it on my website, radhikadesai.com, and it will lead you there. It was called, Marxist Marxist critical political economy and actually existing revolutions. So the anti-imperialist Russian and Chinese revolutions and so on. And it's centrally about why Marxists are not able to deal with imperialism. And in this, I developed this critique of both the NLR tradition and the monthly review tradition more fully. But in a small gist, essentially, Paul Sweezy, who is in many ways one of a handful of figures who were the pioneers of the monthly review approach, very early on, he edited a book in which he had the critique of this idea of the transformation problem. And then I think Hilferding's attempt to defend it and so on. And in it, essentially, he basically said that Bombauer, who initiated this critique, he was kind of trying to be even-handed between Bombauer and Marx and so on. And essentially, he said that this problem cannot be solved. But in reality, it ain't Marx's problem. And again, I've discussed this, and other people have discussed this. Marx does not make the mistake that it's Ricardo's problem. And so, but by essentially throwing in the towel, what he and Monthly Review then did is they essentially left the Marxist apparatus of surplus value and falling rates of profit and blah, blah, and so on. They contributed a lot to the understanding of monopoly and so on. But it was not, and of imperialism, but it was not done in a consistently Marxist fashion. That's my critique. I'm not, and it was not done in a consistently Marxist fashion because essentially at bottom, they ended up agreeing that there was a transformation problem with Marx, so value analysis does not work. So that's my critique. So Zhongjin, do you want me to want to give me some combined questions?
Yes. So one of the question is from New Delhi. The question is about capitalism's, uneven development and something you mentioned in your talk. But these days are the rise of new fascism across the globe, and the left seems to be not so strongly organized, especially at the international terrain, trying to point towards a long and hard stagnation, rather than transition to socialism. So without international organization, cooperation, and initiative of the left, how will these necessary conditions for capital's collapse turn into sufficient conditions? What dialectic would ensure this transformation?
Well, I'll say two things about this. So I would say that my work is really directed at creating a truly international left, because without a proper understanding of imperialism, we cannot create a truly international left. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that there is absolutely no guarantee that capitalism will not collapse until after we have found a way of building socialism. It might collapse and create barbarism instead. It is already creating barbarism. It is, whether you call it fascism or fascistic currents or whatever, but such currents are already emerging in all our countries. And they are really, really dangerous. They are exploiting the genuine difficulties created by capitalism and imperialism for working people, but directing them in the wrong direction. So we are already in very, very deep doo-doo. And capitalism is not in good shape. It's not capable of creating development. So we need to create an understanding which appreciates what's happening at the international level, which does not say, oh, well, China is just as capitalist and imperialist. China, we have to understand that China is meaningfully socialist. China is not anti-imperialist. Yes, nothing is perfect. China does not claim to be a communist society. China merely claims to be building socialism. But we all have to get on that sort of path. We cannot allow these people, like yesterday I was talking to somebody about Mark Carney, who is going to presumably might soon become the leader, Prime Minister of Canada. Who is he? He's a member of the global elite. He deals in billions and trillions even. These are the kinds of people that are taking power around the world, whether it's the Bidenite form, in the world also seems to be the two parties are becoming international, so on the one hand you have the sort of Bidenites, the Starmerites, maybe the Macronites and the Friedrich Merz types, and on the other you have the Trumps and the Bolsonaros and the whatever these right-wing forces. So you can't, both of these people serve the same financialized, unproductive, imperialist, capitalist class that is dragging the world ever closer to war and nuclear war. I mean, we are already fighting a lot of wars. Some people may say we are already in a world war, God knows. But I'm just saying it is really, really dangerous, and we have to improve our understanding if we are going to do anything.
Thank you. There's a comment about the trickle-down theory and how greed keeps this from happening, like in terms of giving benefits to the whole country. There's one question talking about how you think about the possible imperialist behavior of non-capitalist nations.
Well, exactly. So if you, people argue that China is imperialist, Russia is imperialist, etc. There are two or three things that emerge from my lecture that are directly relevant to this and would oppose that sort of idea. Number one, in a more and more multipolar world, it is increasingly difficult to exert imperial power over other countries. Okay, so that's the first point. Secondly, I would say that what I've tried to show you is that imperialism is rooted in the dynamics of capitalism. If you're not a capitalist country, then you're not compelled to be imperialist. You may end up being so, that's a different question. We can discuss that. It is an empirical issue, not a theoretical issue. But if there is a capitalist society, it is compelled to be imperialist. That's the point I'm trying to make. And so that's, and finally, just on a completely empirical basis, I mean, if you want to test the thesis that, say, Russia and China are just as imperialist as the United States, just call up a map of the worldwide international bases outside US territory that the United States has, and the same map for Russia and China. And you will see that as against the 800 plus foreign military bases that the United States has, China and Russia have a handful.
There's a question about, a large number of local communities and indigenous of people who are actively and successfully developing alternative systems of governance and production with considerable exchange among themselves. That's kind of on the margin of the world market and the nation states in which they are located. Together, they occupy 1/4 of the planet's surface and are successfully improving their quality of life and protecting their territories. They recognize the need for not participating in the political struggles of these nation states. If you can comment on something about.
So this is from David Barkin, who is a friend, and and David, you contributed to our volume on revolutions, and your essay in particular also for me it was very important because in our introduction that Henry Heller and I wrote, I was particularly careful to make sure of essentially bringing this point into my discussion. So let me present it theoretically. So, as you know, I pointed out that Engels said that capitalism can never make the whole world completely capitalist. It is impossible. Domestically, capitalism rests on institutions of states, social institutions, families, etc., which it, of course, corrupts deeply, but it needs them. They're not capitalist. They operate on a non-capitalist basis, and it lives in this cocoon. So there are always, capitalism subordinates other societies, and eventually some of these societies will become capitalist even as capitalism will become socialist even as capitalism continues its existence. And in this, I made it a point to say that indigenous peoples who are relatively less affected by capitalism and its imperialism, if they are able to build lives and communities of their own, have what they need for running these lives, I think that this is part of their resistance, what you, I think, called it our existence or something, which is that their very existence is a form of resistance to capitalism. If they can sustain it, well and good. And I think the more imperialism's power diminishes, the more other countries turn away from this completely mad system and at least embark on a path to socialism, I think their ability to do so will increase. It's a bit like the argument Marx made about the Russian commune, the Russian mir, and so on. So I hope that satisfies you. Hope you think this is a good answer.
Thank you. So there are 2 comments about Trump. I wonder, Norman Harrison, would you like to just be kind of elaborate about your question or your comment? Others, feel free to post your question.
I think Norma is muted. You'd have to unmute her.
Oh.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Hi, Radhika, everybody. I have to go over this myself. The sound has not been nice to me, but I put in here a comment that Trump has detached what's her name? The Democracy Now! Amy Goodman did an interview with the person that made the movie, The Apprentice, the new movie, where you can see Roy Cohn, who killed the Rosenbergs, instructing Trump, never give up. And this is the whole thing that Trump is about, is putting himself out in front and never being allowed to sink from his overwhelming out of place existence in the universe. He is not going anyplace. His policies have no direction about what to do, the objectives of our lives. And that's why everything comes out as a blowhard direction for the moment, for a while he says it. And trying to make sense of him is a waste of time, basically, except that we have to keep up so that we can counter it and develop what we need to do. Thank you.
All I can say is that Trump, I didn't know that, but all I can say is that Trump appears to be exactly the sort of, how can you say, psychopath that you expect such leaders to be. I mean, you know, and I mean, at the end of the day, or rather sociopath, I should say. And at the end of the day, you know, I mean, even Hitler had to give up, but he didn't give up until he knew that he was going to be defeated. You know, he committed suicide. That's giving up. So, but that's interesting what you say. I must watch that film. I haven't watched it. So,
yeah, we see some comment here, and they are all, I think the questions in the Q&A have all answered. Thanks, Deb, for posting the articles. Okay. So, is there any questions in the Q&A? Anyone would like to add some intervention? I actually see Professor Michael Hudson there. I would like to see if, Michael, you have anything you would like to add? Okay, so let me go back to the, okay. No, okay, so
The thing to watch is not, what did you say you were going to watch? The movie. The thing to watch is the Amy Goodman interview with the person who made the movie. That, I think, has the substance that we'd like to utilize. You get it by asking Amy Goodman talks about The Apprentice, and you could get the Amy Goodman show.
great.
thanks, Norman. Okay, so I think that's all we have today. Thank you a lot, Radhika. This is a very good opportunity to talk to you and talk to people who are super interested in this topic. We really appreciate your time and your presentation. Towards the end, I would encourage people to follow the publication of RRP, Review of Radical Political Economics. We are expecting to publish the presentation online, and we will also publish Radhika's article in the Review of Radical Political Economics as well. Staying tuned, and we would love to have more opportunities to engage all these important debates, discussions. So Radhika, yes.
Quick question. Will you be posting the video online anywhere? Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, the video is recorded, and we will be more than happy to post the video. Okay, so thanks everyone. We are looking
Thank you,
forward
everyone.
to see you next year in next year's David Gordon Memorial Lecture. Thanks, Radhika, again. Bye.
Thank you.